Okay.
Hey Sula, how are you going?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm really well, actually. I've had a great day, and I said this only on a podcast the other day. I don't suffer with that seasonal affective disorder, but I definitely survive better in the sunshine. I think
Yeah,
I'm part reptile. I just don't do the cold and miserable weather too well.
yeah, same, same.
How's your day been? Because I want to get to, I was going to ask about your day, but I was going to ask to the point of talk to me about disheveled.
Disheveled.
So
Um,
the reference, by the way, to anyone listening right now is that you use that to sum up your morning this morning. I saw on your Instagram stories.
yeah. Do you know when you've just been away and um like all your routines disrupted and then you come back and you're like trying to get your head into it and like yeah, you're not quite there. And I feel like I've not put on makeup for the last week or something. And, I washed my hair and I didn't do anything with it. So it's just like big. And so physically, emotionally, cognitively, I just feel disheveled. Everything's like everywhere.
Mm. You had a nice break though.
Yeah, it was lovely. We went to Sardinia, but we went with two of our friends who are based in the US. So it was some really good quality time, but it's definitely a different break when you're with like, well, their parents as well. So we had their beautiful little 2-year-old, but it's definitely a different sort of pace.
Not
A
quite
lot of
rest,
different people to
not quite
accommodate.
rest and relaxation, right?
Right.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for coming on. I'm going to say that in advance. I'm going to say that many times. I really appreciate your work. And also, apart from your amazing posts, I feel like you probably don't get enough credit for those amazing accompanying illustrations you do. They are done by you, aren't they?
Yeah, I do them. Yeah.
You get credit for those. I feel because I must admit, I looked at them at first and I thought that might be something that you outsourced. And then I caught something. I thought, no, Sula actually does those herself.
Yeah, I do them. It was like a little habit I picked up during lockdown because I used to use Canva. Um, and so if you go like far enough back on my timeline, you'll see like the posts evolve as because I think during lockdown was when my husband got his iPad, or maybe he had it before, but then he got this app called Procreate. And so I just doodle on there. And then I was like, oh, I can make some posts on here actually. Um and then I started kind of refining it a bit, and now I've tried to simplify it as well because I could spend hours just making like one, because I'm not particularly naturally talented at this, so it's definitely, it doesn't come easy, but and also I try and make really complex subjects into some kind of visual representation, and you can either go super literal, which always feels like a letdown, or you can go super abstract, which no one gets. And I think that's why I don't get very much credit, because the algorithm's like, what the hell?
I don't think anyone understands the algorithm. I think there are certain
Yeah.
things we know to appease the algorithm gods. Tends to be less clothing, like polarized titles,
Yeah.
sensationalism. They love that stuff, but I don't think anyone else knows how it works apart from that.
No,
We're definitely going to get on
exactly.
to what you do because I know internal family systems was something specifically I really wanted to chat to you about because I know you did a bit of training in that. And also, I'm going to try not to butcher it. EMDR, so eye movement
Yeah.
and reprocessing. I didn't butcher that, did I? That was
No,
right.
you didn't.
Reading that, I'm
Yeah.
impressed myself, and I played it cool by not saying that out loud as well. So we'll definitely go over those. I'm not going to make you go over what a health psychologist does, but I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, where did your interest come into it? Because I remember we've had a conversation, and it was law. Law is that I have, if I
Mhm.
remember that
Yeah,
correctly?
well remembered. Yeah.
Law originally. What took you from law to health psychology?
So I mean, law was a mistake. Law was like a piece of bad advice, basically. So at A level, I did 4 subjects, and I always knew I was either going to study law or psychology at university. Um, and I was probably most interested in psychology, and the aspect of law that I was interested in was more like, criminal justice, and I don't even know now, it just seems so alien to me that really interested me. But I think probably because my dad's a forensic psychiatrist, so he was always kind of advocating for people who are like mentally ill and being persecuted by the legal system, so maybe that was a bit of it, more subconsciously. Anyway, he had a girlfriend, very, very ex-girlfriend, who her preoccupation was definitely money. So she was like, definitely do law, don't do psychology, it's oversubscribed, it's very competitive, and you make so much more money with law. So being the impressionable, I think she told me that when I was like 14 or 15, that was something that I really took to heart. And then when I went to do law, it was so dull. It's so dull. You have to learn so many things, and they're all so dull. Like pretty much all of them are really dull, apart from like the criminal things. But then what I learned quite quickly in the first year was like, that's the worst paying part of law to go into. So the whole degree is basically geared up to make you a solicitor for some kind of corporate thing, which I have no interest in. And like, yeah, it's never been something that interests me. So
much pressure.
And then there was, pardon?
Sorry to interrupt you. I was just thinking, because there's so much pressure on kind of children to make a decision what they're going to do for the foreseeable. You're talking like 14 when you make your options, is it? Because I think I did
14.
business studies because I just had no idea what to do, but what would look maybe good on a CV. Yet you're supposed to decide then what you're going to do for the rest of your life.
Yeah, you really do set it up so early, because 14 you're choosing your GCSEs, and I guess you still got some flexibility after GCSEs, but soon after GCSEs you're about 16 then, and during that year of being 16 you're choosing your A levels, or if you're not going to do A levels, and of course you can go back, but nobody likes to do that. So it is a lot of pressure. And then your A levels are super drilled down to, I think generally it's 3 subjects rather than 4, depending on where you are, what kind of school you're in and whatnot. And then so you're even more super drilled down, because depending on that, like you could have a change of heart, want to do something in the sciences, and you can't because you chose film and English and something else. So yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
When you're finding your own way, I don't think anyone knows who they are in their teenage years anyway. Sorry, I interrupted
exactly.
you. Sorry.
No, yeah, it's a good point. I think about that because my niece is 16 and she's doing her GCSEs currently, and I'm trying to positively influence her towards psychology.
And the cycle continues.
Exactly. But yeah, so then first year of law, hated it, and I realized like by the December of the first term that I wasn't going to carry on, and that I'd do psychology instead. But they had a weird thing where they was like, you can do that, but you'll have to start from like the first year of psychology, which I was fine about because I was like, another year in uni is like a bonus. But you have to finish your year doing law, so you have to pass your full year doing law. So I had to do a full year of the law degree, but yeah, that was fine. But then it was then in my first year of psychology, we had a module which was health psychology. We had a really charismatic, engaging lecturer, and the subject was just super fascinating. So I was really, really interested in that, and my dissertation was something broadly in kind of the mix between health psychology and social psychology, which I find really interesting. And then again, the pressure of like going out into the world and making money and working, I then went on to work as a marketing manager because I've been working as a marketing assistant. I was trying to claw like how psychology relevant into ways that I could find to earn a living in some way, shape or form. And then I realized that I hated marketing also, and not hated marketing, hated the job, and it wasn't like my full-time passion. I do still find it very interesting, but it wasn't stimulating and it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And that's when I started getting physical health issues and having a lot of experiences that my clients now get with trying to deal with the medical profession and systems really. And having the knock-on impact of how you're treated at work when you're ill, and you know, you lose friends and you feel isolated. So all of this happened, and I was lucky because my dad was doing a master's in mindfulness at the time, and he suggested that I did some mindfulness, which, you know, I always say I was so annoyed because it just felt like it didn't feel like it had any relevance. You know, I had such a physical health issue. Like I was getting cystitis, which is like water infection. So the symptoms are so like profoundly physical. You go to the toilet, you can't pass any urine, but you feel like you really have to go. So I honestly think it's some form of torture to just feel nothing but the urge to wee and not be able to do it. And then the pain comes, but it was happening all of the time. And then I started getting migraines. So initially I was really annoyed that he suggested something psychological, but then fortunately he had a different partner by this time. This was many years later, and she's a clinical psychologist, but her specialism was working with people with physical health issues and chronic pain. And she really concisely and clearly explained why that would be beneficial. She was telling me what my nervous system was doing when I'm having all of these physical symptoms, you know, how my immune system's being impacted by all of this, and how, you know, when everything feels out of control, actually this is one area that we can exert some influence over, which will have a knock-on effect on your physiology. And that appealed because I had absolutely no control and was feeling miserable. So it's like a double bonus, really. So then I started doing some mindfulness, and I found it really, really did help. And I started gradually reclaiming areas of my life. Like I was able to go back to work, and hastily made a plan to then resign and find something else, you know. But I was fascinated by how that could have such a profound effect on your physiology. Like it made sense that psychology would have effect on psychology, but not physiology. Well, it did make sense, but it was interesting. It's still like this magical area.
Yeah,
So
I think it's still fairly abstract for quite a lot of people, that complex interrelationship between mental and physical, because it's, you know, you think of the mental implications that manifest itself biologically in people with things like burnout, stress, anxiety, and the knock-on physical implications. And, you know, exactly as you were, something very physical that had a knock-on impact mentally. I don't like my bias, maybe. I don't think anyone would be in any disagreement, but I don't really think we can have a health conversation without addressing the two in equal measure. But I think probably years gone by, it was predominantly as two separate entities.
yeah, and it still very much is in our healthcare system, really. You know, I often talk about how siloed the healthcare system is, just even within its like physical remit. You know, if you've got a gastro problem, you go to gastroenterology, but if you've got a gynecological problem, you go to gynecology, despite those organs systems being so close to each other and having a knock-on effect often. So there'll be some reference to that in the different departments, but there's not necessarily the integration. You have to go to specialist hospitals sometimes to get the integration. So, you know, if patients with endometriosis, for example, they might have endo that goes beyond like reproductive organs, or predominantly in the bowels, and it's so hard for them to get adequate treatment because the healthcare system's siloed. So if you think about that, but then, you know, more than threefold, thousandfold with mental health, you know, so many stories of people being battered between services. Oh, this is a mental health problem, you go there, and then you get put on medication, or you get some therapy or whatever. Ideally you get some therapy, but then you're then put back into the healthcare system, which then unravels all of that work, maybe to make light of it. But yeah, it's so separated, and that's just it culturally and societally as well. So then it breeds stigma for the person experiencing the physical health impact, because the sentiment is, or if it's psychological, it's your fault, you're not coping properly, or you did this to yourself, which is, you know, so far from the truth. But that's the only way the message seems to kind of be expressed or communicated.
Yeah, which imposes blame, you know, ultimately people internalizing those sentences of failure. So I gather from a clinical perspective, would it be most people come to you essentially to equip that toolbox into how to obviously with the whatever medical intervention they're having as well, but from a psychological tools perspective, they work with you to better equip themselves with dealing with those things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've got some sub areas of specialism in, so I work with people generally with chronic illness. I also work with people without chronic illness, but people who choose to work with me, usually there's some kind of overlap with like physiology. So, burnout, chronic stress, or PTSD and trauma, because it has such a big impact on, what's happening in the brain and the body. But yeah, I worked in the NHS working with a mixed caseload of people with anxiety, depression, all those kind of mental health disorders without physical health issues. But my subspecialisms, or the areas that I'm like super interested in and do a lot of research on, it's like gut disorders and pelvic and gynecological disorders and bladder disorders, because I feel like I'm just super interested. I guess the bladder and gynae stuff is from my own experience, but also there's such an intuitive link between our psychological experience and those organs. Like we can see really clearly how those systems are affected just even by the stress response, acutely. So never mind like long-term and chronically. But yeah, to answer your question, people will come at different stages and for different things. So people with IBS, we might be able to help them massively reduce their symptoms by using various kind of CBT protocols. But people with endometriosis, I mean, can actually help reduce symptoms also, but the primary thing might be coping with like flare-ups, or coping with like the psychological impact of having to deal with something and all the like different ways that your life is impacted. So yes, essentially I'm trying to equip people with ways of understanding their experience and then ways to implement things that will work.
Sure, because I guess there is still quite a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to the workplace, and but as to what you kind of suggested, that without a manager maybe that fully understands what you're experiencing is kind of poo-pooed a little bit, disregarded as something less traumatic for some people, without you being too free with that word, is because I gather it is for some people. It's quite traumatic what they've experienced over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm still always surprised by how not understanding workplaces are, because I just think even just from a return on investment front, like it makes so much sense that you get an employee that's healthy, that can stay in work and that wants to be in work, as opposed to pushing them to get back when they don't feel ready. They're not going to do the work properly, or they're going to burn out quicker. It just makes no sense. But I've had so many patients who they get letters from the GP, they get signed off by something else, they'll have had like accidents, actual like car accidents, and their employer's still like, no, you have to come back full time, but we'll put you on this kind of work instead. Like that's not the same thing.
Yeah, a phrase I was introduced to quite recently, it must have been about 6 months ago. You've probably come across it, I imagine. Well-being washing. So, funnily enough, out the back of a health pandemic and health crisis, a lot of people have a lot of businesses from I guess almost from like a virtue signaling, public facing appearance for the sake of optics. They talk a lot about the well-being of their employees, but actually they did a study, and I'm going to butcher the numbers, but proportionately there was a much higher number of the people that were portraying a certain image and the ones that are actually following through with the support, with instances of, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling burnt out, I really need some time off, and them saying, oh, we'll just get you a new computer, and little things like that, basically totally disregarding, or I need an assistant, or I need time off, or I can do everything for you apart from those things.
Yeah.
It's like a very much a public facing thing for the sake of optics, I find, with a lot of businesses that I've worked with, but something they don't necessarily all follow through with.
Yeah, the NHS is a good example of
Wow. Yeah.
washing.
So I gather like most of it's privately, then people come to you, or through referral now.
Yeah, privately. So I used, it's been over a year now that I stopped working for the NHS. So now it's all private. Either they find me or it's through referrals from doctors and dietitians and physios.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you spoke of a little bit of the work that you do, and it's not quite a seamless link, but you did mention post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. Can we talk a little bit about some of the techniques that you use, like EMDR, and perhaps then we
Yeah.
can seamlessly move into internal finances? I'm so fascinated to hear about that, just
Yeah.
because out of the therapeutic interventions I've had over the years, that was one of the ones that made the most sense to me
Mm.
and actually helped me cultivate a little bit more of a sense of self-compassion, which I realized up until that point wasn't really present.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it would be really interesting to talk about that.
For the sake of anyone that doesn't know, because I haven't tried it in the classical sense, I've tried the butterfly hug technique,
Mhm.
the EMDR.
Yeah.
Could you just outline what EMDR is and what it roughly involves? I know obviously there's details you can't include.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a fascinating story about how the therapy was developed. Have you heard of it? Have you heard it?
I've heard bits and pieces. You probably know all the little intricate details I've never heard though.
No, I don't have a brain for intricate details, but just it was discovered by accident, right? There was a psychologist called Francine, Francine or Francis. Oh my gosh.
I've heard the accident bit. I can't remember names though. I'm going off you. You're the
Either
expert.
Francine or Francis Shapiro. I think it's Francine. Anyway, she was walking her dog, and she was kind of mulling over some like difficult stuff, and she realized when she was doing it her eyes were going back and forth, back and forth. And so, being the kind of scientific psychologist that she was like, oh, there's something in this. So she started then studying the impact of the eye movements, left to right, or right to left, just oscillating side to side, essentially, what impact that had on people's ability to be with distressing memories and stuff that they're processing. And initial studies were like finding it did enable kind of more of a tolerance of it, so it was less overwhelming, but it in itself, it wasn't like sufficient to what we now kind of call as process. It didn't mean that these things were then put to bed and they weren't as impactful on people's kind of functioning and other things and mood overall. So then from there it was like tailored to all these kind of EMDR protocols. So the essence of EMDR is, with a therapist, you work out what the basis of the difficulty that you're having is. So initially this was an approach used for post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's quite clear, that there's a big trauma that's happened. That's the target. We're going to process that, and we're going to aim then to get rid of, PTSD flashbacks, if you're having nightmares, the extreme avoidance, hypervigilance, all that kind of stuff. That's where it started with the therapy. But and it was found to be super effective in essentially getting rid of PTSD, so people don't have those symptoms anymore. And we already had trauma focused CBT, which is shown to be really effective for that. But the beauty, and being trained in both, the beauty of EMDR is it's often a lot quicker, the gains are a lot quicker, but also it seems to be less I can't say less intense, but intrusive for people, because in trauma focused CBT, although it's very effective, and I really enjoyed using that, you have to get people to like relive the specific trauma bit by bit, and they're telling you out loud. And there's definitely something to that. But in EMDR, especially when it's something like really difficult, where there's issues with consent, if it's been a sexual assault or something like that, or it's been something against somebody's will, in trauma focused CBT, it could feel wrong to try and get someone to go on, tell me what happened next, and
Sure.
really distressing and overwhelming. And of course, if somebody's too distressed and overwhelmed, they can't carry on with the therapy, and then they can't get the benefit. So with the EMDR, the beauty is they don't really have to tell you very much. All of the processing is going on in their own head, and they're just reporting in bit by bit. So what the process looks like is you set up the memory you're going to work on. So if it's a PTSD, it'll be a trauma memory, the trauma memory rather. And then you use bilateral stimulation. So that's why it's called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, because it it began with just the eye movement. So watching a pen being waved right to left, or a light, or, you know, there's all sorts of fancy tech things now, but essentially all you need to do is have your eyes moving left to right. So the therapist would instigate that, and you would follow. And then that bilateral stimulation allows the memory to come up in a way that your brain is then able to tolerate without too much distress, but it also starts to bring in extra information that it hasn't had an opportunity to bring in. So how I often explain it is that usually when something distressing comes up, a distressing memory or concept, we've got these helpful brain shortcuts in a lot of sense that help us kind of exit out of there. So the emotion comes up maybe before we've even realized it's come up, and then our brain's like, no, we're not going there. And it can be super automated, so a lot of times we're not aware of it. But the difficulty with that is it prevents our brain from then processing at any point. Something's just locked away, and that doesn't mean that it, you know, with time it heals. It just doesn't. It stays there in different ways, and, you know, there's different cognitive strategies that we then develop to try and manage that. So in order not to think about that, you know, I won't go to, I don't know, the seaside anymore, or, you know, me and my friends won't talk about this, or, and then, you know, your world can get smaller and smaller, but your system gets more and more hypervigilant. So in EMDR, your brain's being given that opportunity, that front cognitive part of your brain that usually is the one to step in and go, not now, is kind of occupied with the bilateral stimulation, but also the emotion centers aren't so reactive. So in two different ways, you're able to kind of have this information in your consciousness in order for your overall brain, I guess, to assimilate that information. And that can go really, really quickly for some people, and for some people it takes a bit longer. And of course the therapist is there to facilitate blocks when they come up. But that's generally how it works. And if it's not PTSD, I use it now a lot with people without PTSD, because the principle of PTSD is a really helpful one for us to understand, like, what happens to our brain when we're traumatized. But there's a whole continuum of trauma and distress, and it's not always, you know, when we're in severe risk of danger or harm, you know, that our brain kind of goes into oh shit mode. It can be when our sense of worth is threatened, or when we felt completely neglected. So the EMDR therapy works in exactly the same way. It's just the setup that is slightly different, because we're looking at, okay, what's currently causing you difficulty, and how can we trace that back to, you know, beliefs that have been generated from difficult events previously.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's such a valuable point probably to mention there as well, is, you know, the work that you do is based on your credentials, your experience and ethical practice and everything else. Because I see a lot of these insta therapy sound bites, and not that I'm anyone to challenge those, but things like lean into your pain. And I just think it probably should be done with like a psychologist. A lot of people are in these like points of avoidance for a good reason. Like our brain has this wonderful ability to protect ourselves. If someone needed to lean into something, it would be seeking someone out like you, rather than take someone's advice on Instagram with a blue tick, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, I say blue tick, it doesn't matter anymore. Anyone's got, you can buy a blue
Yeah,
tick,
exactly.
can't you? Yeah, it's changed. You don't earn it anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you used the technique yourself in the past? Have you found it helpful? I'd probably compare it to turning down the dimmer switch almost. It's like that those presence of those feelings are still there. It's just they're not as heightened when you employ these techniques.
I mean, for me, so I used
If you don't mind
EMDR.
me asking, that is, you can
I
tell.
don't mind. When I was in the NHS, and it was after, you know, we started going back to the office. So it'd been like a good, maybe well over a year that I'd been working at home. And everything had gotten worse during the pandemic, you know, people's mental health, the work conditions, because you're not being the light relief of just seeing colleagues and, you know, being able to debrief. So it was super hard, yeah, to say the least. And I think, like, most people now as well have this sense of losing a year of their lives, and then also the complication of how do I reintegrate in now, like what do I want for my life. There just seemed to be much more pressure on that, but also, you know, what you'd taken for granted as like meaningful maybe just didn't seem as meaningful. It's super destabilized. And then as someone who's experienced depression like numerous times throughout my life, I tried therapy once, which is kind of like a funny bad story, or yeah, let's say once, and it wasn't helpful. It was really bad, and it really put me off, despite the profession that I'm in, which is surprising to a lot of people. But I was like, okay, I'm going to do therapy now. I've been learning and doing EMDR, and I thought this could be helpful, because the difficulty when you're a therapist and a psychologist, which we should all be on the lookout for, is that you think because you understand and you can formulate yourself that you you're not going to learn anything from therapy, which is like such flawed thinking when you say it out loud. But you know, those are the therapist beliefs. Anyway,
we all have blind spots.
I finally went to therapy and had EMDR, and it made such a huge difference, because there were all these things that I've been carrying around for so long, and I'd processed in lots of different ways. You know, like I journal, I speak with people, I, you know, do loads of, I do mindfulness. So it's not like I'd been ignoring these issues, which I guess is why I thought, what else is therapy going to add to this? But it felt like it just like picked it all up and like put it out, like just evaporated it. And it wasn't that I didn't feel anymore like they weren't justifiable things to be sad and upset about, but it just didn't feel like I had to carry them anymore. It was just like a weight being lifted. So a lot of the memories that we processed, I could go back to them and I feel absolutely like nothing emotional at all anymore. And for a while there were things that had massively like annoyed me, you know, just interactions that I would have with certain people, that I would be like, right, I need to just like not feel this bad about it. I know where it's coming from, but why do I still get so reactive? And then there was this whole honeymoon period for a good long, like maybe not a year, but not that far from it, where I was like, it just slid off me. I was like, oh, whatever. And now
Yeah, that
now I
works
still feel
ongoing,
the
right?
irk.
There's little niggles. I've got this now. No, I haven't.
But yeah, but that's, I guess, you know, because it's consistent work, isn't it? All of these things, it's not like you switch something off.
Yeah, yeah. I find that a lot of these things, especially what I refer to as like the deeper work. A lot of people, we scratch the surface. We think it's one thing. It offers, you know, it offers so much more on a deeper level. I think even if you've got a set level of self-awareness, is, as I said, like there's always those blind spots. So a lot of people think they reach that definitive end, like, oh, I'm fixed, or as Instagram would tell us, I'm healed.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's ongoing stuff, right? And we all have lapses. I certainly have, you know, because we're all subject to chaos around us that's out of our control, and we don't know the impact of that sometimes. Can we talk all about your internal family systems experience? Because I know a little bit from what I've read and what I've like put into practice, I guess. But I'd love to hear about it from a practitioner point of view in your training, because you took a little bit more of a vested interest.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done the full IFS training, which I definitely want to do, but I've agreed with myself I won't do any more training for it.
You've been quite busy by the sounds of it recently, and I want to hear all about that as well. After.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely am a compulsive like doer and learner. So yeah, I just did a 1-day IFS course, but I'd been using it in my practice because when I get my EMDR supervision, often my supervisor will suggest working with blocks or particular things using parts. So I'd started doing some reading around what that whole concept was and how you could do it. And it sounded intuitive, but it also sounded a bit odd. So I was like, what is this that,
It's
when
funny
you
that it's
say,
ingrained in our language, because I thought when I was introduced to it, and even the phrasing, oh, there's a part of me. We
yeah,
refer to ourselves in parts often.
exactly. So very intuitive. But then when my supervisor's there going, it really sounds like this part's coming up for that person. So maybe you could ask it, what's it scared of? And I'm like, when you say ask it, what's it scared of? Like, how does that dialogue like play out? And she's like, well, and then I was like, oh, well, that's odd.
It's
Okay.
quite uncomfortable the first couple of times, because I think my therapist, when I was talking about it, asked me to refer to little Dan, and I was like, I'm not comfortable with this phrasing.
Yeah.
No one wants to refer to themselves as little anything. But yeah, you get your head around, referring to yourself in the third person, which is a little bit of an ick for me. People talking about themselves in the third person. Sorry, that's off topic anyway. But yeah, it's quite abstract, and it feels very uncomfortable because someone is watching you have this dialogue with yourself out loud.
Mm, yeah, exactly. And a lot of my clients can't do that. So I do it slightly differently. And I also let them choose the terminology because because also it's important that you connect with them, right? The parts. And if it doesn't, like, I might say the manager part, but this part might just seem really bossy to someone and less like a manager, more like a tyrant. So then, yeah, anyway, there's different ways to try and like connect with those parts. But that was what spurred my decision to go and do a bit of training. And it was such a unexpected experience, this training, because I'd done a lot of reading now and I'd been using it in EMDR training, so I got a lot of the concepts. And the beginning part of the training was being introduced to that, but then using some experiential exercises to do it. And the first one was this exercise where you have a dialogue with whatever parts are present. Yeah, that's it. So there were some prompts. I think we all closed our eyes, and you're just prompted to have a dialogue with whichever part showing up, like how are they feeling, what do they want you to know, blah blah blah. And then at the end of that moment, you then do a bit of artwork that illustrates what came up for you. And I had the most like lovely experience of my manager part. So in IFS, by the way, probably for context for listeners, so the idea is that there's you yourself, which is like ultimately when you're yourself, you're all the wonderful qualities, right? You're curious, you're calm, you're all the other C's that are good. But what gets in the way of you kind of being truly yourself in that equilibrium is these parts that have been developed to protect you. So at somewhere along the timeline of your life, probably quite early on, you've experienced some distress or something really difficult, and then what's called your exile part is born first, and that like holds all the pain. But because of these brain shortcuts, essentially, it's pushed down and not acknowledged because that's too painful and we don't want to spend too much time with that difficult emotion. And this isn't necessarily and generally not a conscious thing that we do, it just happens automatically. But in order for us not to feel that horrible emotion ever again, whatever it might be, being scared or being sad or alone, we then develop these parts. And so one of those parts is the manager part, whose motto is never again. So whatever you felt, never wants to go back there. So it's all about kind of being proactive in avoiding that. And then there's the firefighter part, which is the like get you out of here quick part. So whenever that feeling starts to come up, its job is just to get you out of there quickly. And so we can already see that there's going to be tricky dynamics, because the firefighter part is going to be at odds with the manager is going to be at odds with the exile. It all gets very complicated. But what I really liked about IFS is that the premise is that these parts are just there to protect you. They've got their quirks and they might not always be helpful, but they were born out of extreme pain and trying to prevent that from happening. So I was having this lovely experience of my manager part and myself having this dialogue, and I was seeing all these lovely colors of them coming together. And at the time I was super busy. Yeah, super busy. And my self was saying to my manager, you know, I so appreciate all that you do. You know, you get so much stuff done. We've been so productive, like we've got so much to show for it, but you know that you like take it too far, right? And the manager was like, yeah, I do take it too far, and I'm sorry, like we can chill out, we can find like a middle ground. Like, and then there was this lovely little interaction, and then just below this kind of lovely meeting of these two parts was more of like a grey purpley area, which was like my exile and my firefighter part, who weren't really online. Like they were just like there, but not they didn't really have much to say. So I felt moved to tears by this, which never happens. Like I do all these therapy trainings and I never feel like particularly emotionally affected, where I've had like cohorts of colleagues where they've cried at certain things, and I've never connected in that way. But this, I was like, oh wow, I feel like really moved. And that I unmuted in front of like hundreds of therapists to like, you know, prompted, not just out of the blue, to tell them how lovely it had been. So I was like, yeah, this makes total sense to me now, like how you could have a dialogue with these parts and how it can give you that compassion and, you know, find these habits and work them out a little bit. The second half of the training, I was like, this is going to be so lovely. We got put in a group, like a couple with another therapist that was learning on the day as well. And we were given the instruction, and the instruction was, you simply wanted to find out more about what the manager part was concerned about. So I was like, easy, we've just had a lovely conversation, this is going to be so nice, let's chat some more. So the therapist that was facilitating this dialogue for me definitely didn't know what was gonna happen, and neither did I. But she had this like, you know, argument with her manager, like, you're always asking for too much. And then there's like the firefighter that was, you know, completely burnt out, and she had her own experience, and then came on to me, and I was like, okay, yeah, let's do it. And it just started really quickly, where it's like, so what is it that you're concerned about? And then it was so interesting because I just felt this like kind of, oh shit, I don't think I want to know this moment. And then she kept going, which was the task, like asking me questions. And the more she asked, the more clarity I was getting, but also the more emotional I was getting. So I was in floods of tears, which never happens when I'm doing these trainings. So I was like, I'm sorry, I don't usually get like this. I'm not one of those people, whoever those people are, you know. And she's like, it's okay, you know, this is obviously like something that needs to process. But it caused this huge revelation, which was like, which I'd been vaguely aware of, that, you know, a lot of the reason that I push forward so much is because I'm worried about like stability, you know, things could just go away. But I never really connected with that idea massively because I didn't have a hugely, at least, you know, financially unstable upbringing. And, you know, as far as things go, I don't know, like, again, cognitively as an adult, I would represent it as, you know, fairly balanced in that regard. But for some reason, I've got this deep-seated fear that everything will suddenly go away. And there was a particular concern around this. So, you know, being a 34-year-old woman, not having had kids yet, biological clock is everywhere, you know, on social media, on all, and I work in women's health a lot. So yeah, all of that was coming up about, well, when are you going to have kids? And if, you know, if you don't get things more stable, then it's going to be, you know, when the window even reduces and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, this was something, what was really interesting was this was something that multiple times I checked in with myself about this, and it's not been something that I've avoided. Like, I've had conversations with my husband, we've talked about it, we've calculated stuff, but suddenly, like, the emotion of it all came up, and it was just, I could appreciate this huge pressure that my manager part had been under for so long, whilst trying to simultaneously, like, push down this deep-seated fear that you might never have kids. So yeah, it was this really moving, revelatory experience, which I had not expected to come just from like a little training exercise. So I was very convinced by the power of this, and just getting you to switch into a different mode that usually you might have defenses up.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, by the way. I
Yeah.
wasn't going to press any of that point because, as I said, my first experience with it was just developing this sense of compassion. Because I think for such a long time is those parts we're maybe ashamed of, or our exiles that we've shunned to one side, is we treat ourselves like we need to rid ourselves of them, like they
Yeah.
are defective, they are unlovable, we need to do away with them, without recognizing, I guess this is the self-compassion bit for me, is that they served a purpose at some point. Like, that was there for a reason, whether I was aware of it or not. That served a purpose in terms of protecting me. So yeah, with all these things, and we do naturally, I think, in our brains, it operates on such a sinister level of self-deception, is we're totally unaware of it until we shine a light on it. And it's often with things like IFS that things just fall into place and make sense, because it, we stick a lot of the things into back our subconscious under rocks for a good reason sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really helped me appreciate, like you're saying, those blind spots. You I don't think it really shone a light on how many of them, not how many, but just how or automatically and organically they happen for us, and like you say, super beneficial, in lots of respects, but also it means that the work's never really done, and we don't want it to be done. Like, life's a constant evolution of all different things, circumstances, what's going on internally, priorities, whatever. So we don't have to delve into like a dark box to fix or to find the trauma, but providing the opportunity to really check in, so that you know that you are on the same page as yourself, because actually a lot of the time we cannot be and not know it.
Yeah, I found for mine a lot of worth is sought out in being productive.
Mm-hmm.
And I never bought into that classic male archetype as in terms of my own thinking, because my mum brought me up on her own, more or less. So I never thought I was a classic male archetype in that. And I think that taps into a lot of, and not without distinctly making this a male thing, but these classic type provider protector archetype. So sometimes when things, for me especially, I could only make reference to myself, is when things feel out of control, I feel like I'm failing some primitive duty, which attacks my sense of self and my sense of self-worth. So I go into this hyper chaotic, like productive, must be doing everything, spinning all these plates things. And that, again, that was the first thing that made sense for me. So if anyone would reference that, I'm not gonna, I think I might mispronounce it. Richard Schwartz.
Schwartz.
Schwartz. Is it Schwartz? See, last time I said Schwartz, I was told no, that's, you got to pronounce it in
Really?
the German way. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah,
He said
Richard.
Schwartz. I
Does
just did a
he?
bit of training, and I'm
Okay.
sure he
Well, I've just embarrassed myself, haven't I, in very publicly? But it's
Schwartz.
okay. And his book is No Bad Part. So I was introduced to it by my therapist. I know we've had chats in private about it, but that book really helped me piece things together. And that lists all the tools in there and everything else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great book.
thank you for sharing those bits. It's not something I try to press on people, but just I think it's quite interesting if you're looking at that deeper work on yourself, because again, it's so deceptive. Is you need other people to highlight things for you sometimes,
Yeah,
or bring your
absolutely.
awareness to it at least.
Yeah, because sometimes it's, because also I think, I've been talking a bit about expectations of therapy. When people come, they think that commonly they hold conscious or unconscious belief that we'll talk about things, they'll get the information, and then they'll feel better. But sometimes it's not sometimes, most of the time, there can be light bulb moments, but it's more about the drip 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 of like hearing the same thing in different ways and trying it out in different ways. That's how we learn, and that's how we make changes. And I think if we can start at very surface level, just like identifying, oh, I think I've got a manager part, it doesn't mean that we then have to go and like root around for our exile, you know.
I think a lot of people, and I don't want to say part of my problem with that strength in speaking narrative is kind of just speaking is not enough. And I found even with the talk therapy that I've done is talk therapy, depending on obviously what you're dealing with, that can only get you so far sometimes, which is why these other tools and these practices are really helpful.
Yeah, because I mean, in order to really make change, it takes action, really. It takes like embodiment, and that's the hard part. Yeah, and that can be an uncomfortable discovery when people come to therapy as well.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point I hadn't thought to bring up with you, but that embodiment of practice, and I suspect the reason why people find things like mindfulness and meditation so difficult is because they become so disembodied. They're not attuned with their body anymore. So actually, the thought of sitting there with their feelings and their thoughts around things is quite an uncomfortable thing to get their head around.
I was just talking, I can't remember who with now, but about this question of, have we generally, as a society, like had our ability to tolerate uncomfortable things reduced? Not to say like the world's a squeaky clean place and everything's bliss, because it obviously isn't, but you know, everything's so accessible. We can like switch on our laptop if we're bored, like we've got a billion
I
options for
definitely agree
anything.
with that. I think we're not very good at just dealing with boredom.
Exactly. And
Other,
yet the research shows that boredom is so important for
mm,
the way our brain works and functions and problem solving and all sorts.
that brings me to something else because I had to write it down because
Yeah.
it's a reference that you made, discomfort aversion defaults, because that straight away springs to mind, doom scrolling on social media and all of these little time fillers that we do because boredom we just can't deal with seemingly.
Yeah, whether it's boredom or something else that we haven't identified as what it is, like this anxiety, like people often think about anxiety as like a real overwhelming panic or like worry, but anxiety can just be that like, oh, I don't like now, however you feel that, like a slight discomfort or just wanting to get out of now. And so sometimes people don't even identify that as some kind of anxiety, but I mean, and the label almost doesn't matter so much, but it is a uncomfortable emotional experience that you're trying to get out of. And sometimes that's fine, you know, but if that's always the response, you're always trying to get out of it, that's when it's problematic, because then you develop these unhelpful habits that reduce your ability to work through difficult stuff and actually get to the heart of like why these patterns of procrastination happen, for example, or you know, why you end up getting these headaches on an evening all of the time. And
I find it quite a lot with things like emotional eating.
yeah,
Like,
exactly, that's a
I
really
can recognize this is an unhealthy pattern I'm falling into, but actually the pain and discomfort that I'm experiencing now, I just need to get rid of it. Like I just
yeah.
want to do away with this and I don't really know how to. So that, few people have that diverse toolbox again. It's just this thing I know can lean on. It brings me some sort of comfort, safety, it soothes me somehow. I might come to regret it, but I do it anyway.
And that, I mean, bringing it back to IFS, that's the firefighter, right? That's the
Mm.
thing that's helping us get out of it straight away. And I think sometimes we can lean into that. Like sometimes that's totally fine. Um,
I think emotional eating is something we all do. It's just
yeah,
it becomes problematic when it's the only tool in the toolbox. Is how I
exactly.
always reference it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I'm always wondering like who, probably the people that are reading those posts are the ones that already are aware that they have these
Mm.
discomfort, aversion.
Just confirmation bias. Everyone's just scrolling, nodding along. The people that desperately need it will never see it.
Yeah, right, exactly. But then yeah, it's not, I mean, it's not something that I'm truly worried about, but I do wonder like what's the pathway between someone being completely unaware of all their discomfort, aversion defaults, to then slowly starting realizing they have it, and then deciding to work on it. Like, I'm super, of course that'd be different for everyone, but what pushes them along to then decide to work on it? And yeah, you're going to say something.
No, I'm just thinking about that because I haven't described it as eloquently as you in the past, but it's almost, I feel you need a level of self-awareness to become more self-aware. Like, what if you never cultivate that sense of self-awareness in the first
Yeah,
place? And I
exactly.
think that's probably why people get into cycles of behavior. They even objectively can't really recognize a destructive, not just to themselves, but others around them as well. I find it quite interesting, this narrative around, oh, this person's a red flag, that person's behavior is a red flag. And I can't help but think that if everyone and all the behavior around you is a red flag, then actually it might be closer to home.
Yeah.
But people don't seem to recognize that one. So yeah, but it's that whole any sort of behavior change, I guess, is people need to want to investigate that further themselves, even if you can see objectively from as an outsider they desperately need it. It's that shame, that paradoxical effect that just forces them to withdraw and go back to and having nothing to do with you, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly.
As possible. Can you tell me a little bit, because I'm hugely conscious of your time. Actually, I didn't even realize it was that
Don't
late.
worry, I'm not in a rush.
Of your exciting new project, or am I getting ahead of myself? Am I allowed to ask? Because I'm going to ask you where people can find out more about you anyway.
Yeah, so what is it? So the idea behind this,
Because I've
because
been a total pain in chasing you, and understandably, you're super busy. And like, just leave me alone, man.
no, not at all. No, I mean that, like, that's always the way anyway. I'm always like, yeah, next month I'll be freer, and then it never happens. But I am trying to be freer this month. But yeah, the project, so it's something that I've wanted to do for ages, is create a resource bank essentially of knowledge and tools for people to use in order to I guess do that work that's like the constant cultivation, right? So it's not like a therapy alternative, but it could be like a helpful therapy adjunct, or someone after therapy, or someone that doesn't feel like they need therapy but they want to like learn a bit more about themselves, and managing different things that they struggle with, whether that's like feeling anxious or whether that's physical symptoms. So I've purposefully tried to cultivate it so that it's not just for people with chronic health issues, or just for people with anxiety or depression. I want to, I've pulled out the commonalities, because I think, as important as it is to have tailored support, it is also helpful to understand that we are humans with like universal difficulties that can often, we tailor them to our own experience, but they all join up together essentially. So how we believe, how we build belief systems, how we manage our discomfort, how we interact with other people and seek support or don't seek support. So the program's made into 3 modules, or 3 modules I call it. Body, which is all about the physiology of what's happening in our body, so we understand like what our brain's doing, very broadly speaking, what our nervous system does, and how these things underpin both physical health issues but also like psychological things that come up. So a common one is worrying. Like, if we know what's happening in our brain when we worry, then we can work with the worry slightly differently. For example, if we know what's happening in our nervous system when we experience pain, we can respond slightly differently than just kind of despairing and trying to think through the fact that we might be in pain forever. So the body module is kind of like the foundation for everyone to get a broad understanding of like their physiology and how that impacts mental and physical health. And then the mind module is like the psychological techniques that you can use to bridge the two. And then the social module is all about connection and cultivating healthy relationships and assertiveness, which is a big topic for a lot of my clients. But also there's like a community aspect. So people working through the program in whatever order they want to do can chat with each other. There'll be like discussion threads, and then each week we'll come together for like a live workshop where we'll discuss like a particular topic that's been on the website, and doing a practice together and discuss and explore. So the idea is for it to be affordable for people like to keep working. There's not like a get better by this point. It's just, let me explore this, let me explore like what my thoughts are doing over the next month, and then next month maybe I'll explore like, I don't know, progressive muscle relaxation and how that helps me relax or not, or yeah, whatever I learned from that.
That sounds great, because I think on a societal level, there is just a question of accessibility for a lot of people. They
Right.
don't have the means to seek out private care. They don't have the means or the time, maybe to even visit their GP, or they feel they, as you've kind of attested to, they don't get the level of support they would hope. So this gives them some autonomy and some skills and something they can practice at home. I think there's such a valuable point you mentioned there. I don't see too much of it. Maybe it's my echo chamber, but that whole just human connection and community being such an important aspect of well-being, which isn't really addressed too much. We tend to think of it as diet, nutrition, psychological skills, but just being connected with other people is such a primitive, important part of our makeup.
Like one of the biggest things, but it's just no attention's paid towards it societally and like structurally. There was a thing about social prescribing, which when they started rolling it out was really, really helpful, but then I think funding's got cut, and now it's kind of changed how they do it. And just even the way our like society is set up, these little silos that everybody is in, whether it's like couple silos or family silos or uni friend silos, but then that all gets disbanded when you go into the working world. And our opportunity for community, particularly in a kind of a busy city like London, but then there'll be issues like in remote places, is not having that option, that accessibility to be amongst people. And I think then it puts an added layer of pressure on socializing, because you want to get the most out of the people that you're with, but then they don't meet your expectations, you don't meet your own expectations. It
Making
can be
friends as
very
you get older is harder, because
yeah
you're time restricted. People have busy careers, they may have families, they may have social things they do, they might go away quite often. It's not for a want of trying, I think, for a lot of people. It's just the practicality of it.
yeah, exactly, the practicality. And then when there's just not like a ready-made community there for you to access, it just puts such an onus on you to like try and organize, and then you feel so alone because you feel like you're the only one that's trying to put the effort in. Or even if you don't feel like that, you just feel alone because practically it's really hard to meet up with people. So what I really wanted to make with this Body Mind Connect was like, this will be here weekly. There'll always be someone to talk to on the forum, maybe not live, but you can all, you'll always get feedback, and there'll always be like a weekly thing. So there's a shared kind of collective commitment to oneself, and just cultivating nice little connections. They don't have to be lifelong intense friendships, but it's just nice to like show up and have something there.
Yeah, amazing. And where can people go if they want to find out a few more details about that?
Good question.
To be confirmed.
Yeah, probably my Instagram page is the best place, because I delayed it slightly with my trip.
That's okay. I think that's allowed. But I'll direct people there anyway, obviously, without question. And your Instagram handle is
The underscore health underscore psychologist underscore.
amazing. Yeah, nearly as catchy as well. I never thought my handle through when I realized I had to repeat it to other
Yeah.
people. Yeah, they won't warn you about that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I
Yeah.
appreciate your valuable time, because I know you have much more important things to do. So
No.
thank you for giving up some of it. I was going to do the little head tilt when you was talking, but I thought that might put you off the doggy, because your beautiful pup keeps springing up in the background.
She likes to get a bit of camera time.
I,
Maya.
I always hijack these things with just pup talk, because I
Oh,
have to leave.
she's wagging her tail.
Oh, bless. What's her name?
Maya.
Maya. I have to leave Daisy in the house because she would just be pawing at my leg and want to cuddle to see
Oh,
who I'm talking to.
that's
Yeah.
cute.
We
Oh,
don't deserve them. They're better than people.
I don't look at her.
I can see that little tail wagging. I can. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your evening. If anyone has listened to this and they've found it mildly interesting, I think they definitely will. But if you could like, subscribe, and maybe give us a rating, some valuable and constructive feedback, always welcome. But yeah, thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure.